It had been a long, grueling year, and Claire and Ryan were both at their breaking points. The stress of work, the constant noise of the city, and the never-ending rush of everyday life had worn them down. They needed a break, desperately. After weeks of searching, they stumbled upon what seemed like the perfect escape: a small, remote cabin deep in the mountains, miles from any town. The listing boasted tranquility, no cell service, no internet, just pure, undisturbed nature. It felt like the answer to all their problems. As they packed the car, the idea of disconnecting from the world was both exhilarating and a little unnerving. Claire had always enjoyed the hustle of the city, but lately, it had begun to suffocate her. She was ready for a break, ready for silence. Ryan, who had grown more irritable over the last few months, was eager to escape his relentless workload. The thought of being unreachable for a few days was a relief. The 3-hour drive to the cabin was peaceful, winding through lush forests and up narrow, secluded roads. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the trees grew denser, the air crisper. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the landscape. The cabin itself was small and rustic, with weathered wooden siding and a stone chimney that was already emitting a faint curl of smoke. Surrounding it were towering trees that seemed to guard the place, their leaves rustling softly in the evening breeze. Wow, Claire breathed as she stepped out of the car. The air was fresh, clean, so different from the smog-filled city. The only sounds were the distant trickle of a stream and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was everything they had hoped for. Ryan stretched and smiled for the first time in weeks. "This is perfect," he said, taking in the scenery. "I think this is exactly what we needed." They unloaded their bags and made their way inside. The cabin's interior was cozy, with wooden beams running across the ceiling and a stone fireplace taking up most of the living room wall. A couple of old armchairs sat near the hearth, and the small kitchen was stocked with basic supplies. It was simple but charming, and as Claire looked around, she felt a sense of peace settling over her for the first time in months. They spent the evening sipping wine by the fire, wrapped in warm blankets, talking about anything but work. The stress of the year began to melt away, and Claire found herself laughing more than she had in ages. The crackling fire, the quiet of the woods, and the distant sound of the stream created an atmosphere that felt almost magical. She felt lighter, free from the pressures that had been weighing her down. By the time they climbed into bed, exhaustion from the long drive and months of pent-up tension washed over them. The bed was soft, the sheets cool, and the sound of the wind gently rustling the trees outside lulled Claire into a sense of security. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt like she could breathe. But just as she was drifting off to sleep, a sound jolted her awake. It was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind outside. She lay still, listening. The sound came again, Astra's footsteps star, slow, deliberate, crunching on the gravel outside the cabin. Claire's heart began to race. She tried to brush it off, telling herself it was just her imagination or maybe an animal wandering near the cabin. They were deep in the woods, after all. It wasn't unusual for wildlife to roam the area at night. But as the seconds passed, the footsteps grew louder, more distinct. They didn't have the erratic pattern of an animal. They were steady, deliberate, like someone was walking just outside their door. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Ryan stirred beside her, half asleep. He mumbled, not fully awake. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her eyes fixed on the dark window, barely visible in the moonlight. Ryan listened for a moment, his brow furrowing. But the footsteps had stopped. "It's probably nothing," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "We're in the middle of the woods, Claire. Could be anything. Go back to sleep." Claire wanted to believe him. She wanted to brush it off as nothing more than the creaking of the cabin or the rustle of the wind through the trees. But the sound of those footsteps lingered in her mind, unsettling her in a way she couldn't explain. She lay there for a long time, listening, waiting for the sound to return. But it didn't. Eventually, exhaustion overtook her, and she drifted off to sleep. Still, that gnawing unease settled deep in her chest, refusing to let go. The perfect getaway, it seemed, wasn't as peaceful as it had first appeared. The following day, Claire and Ryan spent hours hiking through the dense forest trails that surrounded the cabin. The crisp mountain air and the beauty of the towering trees did wonders to calm their nerves after the previous night. Claire had almost convinced herself that what she'd heard was just the cabin settling or some harmless animal passing by. The daylight made everything feel less sinister. After all, they were in the middle of the woods. Hearing strange noises at night was to be expected. By the time they returned to the cabin, they were both exhausted, but in a good way. Ryan built a fire in the fireplace, and they ate dinner in its warm glow, the crackling would filling the room with a soothing, familiar sound. The lights in the cabin flickered occasionally, a quirk they'd noticed the night before, but the unreliable power didn't bother them. It only added to the rustic charm of the place, giving it that off-grid, peaceful feeling they'd been searching for. As darkness settled over the cabin, the temperature dropped, and they moved closer to the fire, sipping hot tea and enjoying the simple quiet of the evening. Claire felt more relaxed than she had in months. Her shoulders, which had been perpetually tense from work, were finally loose. Ryan seemed happier, too, smiling more easily and laughing at little jokes that would have annoyed him just a few days ago. But as the fire began to die down, its orange light fading into embers, Claire's sense of peace was shattered. The footsteps were back. At first, they were faint, just the soft crunch of leaves underfoot, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. But then they grew louder, steady, deliberate, the same rhythmic pattern she had heard the night before. Claire's heart leapt into her throat. She sat up, her body tensing instinctively. It wasn't an animal. She knew it this time. The steps were too measured, too purposeful. Whoever, or whatever, was outside wasn't wandering aimlessly. It was moving toward the cabin. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. She nudged him hard. Ryan, half asleep from their long day of hiking, groaned as he shifted in his chair. "What is it?" he mumbled, rubbing his eyes and sitting up slowly. "Listen," Claire urged, her eyes wide. "Do you hear that?" Ryan paused, frowning as he strained to listen. The footsteps continued, steady, slow, circling the cabin. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's probably just an animal, Claire. We're in the woods. Could be a deer or something," he said, his voice calm, trying to reassure her. But Claire shook her head, her pulse quickening. "No, it's not an animal. It's someone walking." She swallowed hard, her mouth dry. "It sounds like footsteps. Human footsteps." Ryan listened again, this time more carefully. The steps were unmistakable now, clear as day. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Whoever it was, they were close, too close. His expression changed, the casual confidence slipping into something more cautious. He stood up, grabbed the flashlight from the table, and moved toward the window. He peered out, shining the weak beam into the darkness. The trees loomed like shadows, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, but there was no sign of movement. "See anything?" Claire asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ryan shook his head, frowning. "No, nothing. But the trees are thick. It's hard to see." "Check the door," Claire said, her voice trembling. "Just make sure it's locked." Ryan nodded and went to the front door, twisting the deadbolt to confirm it was secure. He tried to act casual, but Claire could see the tension in his movements, the way his eyes kept darting toward the windows. He was starting to get worried, too. The footsteps continued for another minute, circling the cabin slowly, methodically. Claire's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with questions. Who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, at this time of night? There were no other cabins nearby, no neighbors, no hikers that she could think of. They were completely alone, weren't they? Then, just as suddenly as the footsteps had started, they stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. The only sound was the faint crackle of the fire and the soft whistling of the wind outside. Claire held her breath, waiting for the footsteps to start again, but they didn't. "Maybe it's gone," Ryan said, turning off the flashlight and sitting back down. He tried to sound reassuring, but there was a tension in his voice that hadn't been there before. Whatever it was, Claire nodded, though she didn't feel any better. She glanced at the window, her stomach churning with unease. Something about the silence felt wrong. Too still, too final. Ryan, clearly exhausted, stretched and leaned back in his chair, his eyelids drooping. "Let's just go to bed. It's probably nothing. We'll be fine." But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. She tried to relax, tried to convince herself that Ryan was right, that it was just an animal or maybe even a trick of the wind. But deep down, she knew better. The footsteps had been too real, too close. And whoever or whatever had been walking outside was deliberate in their movements. They had circled the cabin like they were watching, waiting. Claire lay awake in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind made her flinch. Ryan had fallen asleep beside her, breathing steadily, but Claire couldn't find that same peace. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The footsteps had stopped, but the fear they left behind lingered. And somewhere, deep in the woods beyond the cabin, Claire had the unsettling feeling that they were still being watched. The perfect getaway was quickly turning into a nightmare. By the third night, the sense of unease had become unbearable for Claire. The day had been quiet enough, almost peaceful, but the tension had been building ever since they first heard the footsteps outside the cabin. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside, made her jump. The thought of spending another night in this place sent a chill down her spine. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest, Claire could feel her heart begin to race. The cabin, once cozy and warm, now felt like a trap. The flickering light of the fire no longer brought comfort, and as darkness closed in, her anxiety reached its peak. It wasn't long before the footsteps returned. At first, it was just a faint crunch of leaves, barely audible over the sound of the wind. But as the night wore on, the sound grew louder, more deliberate. Claire sat on the edge of the couch, her eyes darting toward the window. She was sure the footsteps were closer this time, circling the cabin, as if whoever, or whatever, was watching them was no longer content to stay at a distance. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "They're back." Ryan had been sitting by the fire, trying to relax, but he could see the fear in her eyes. He had brushed off her concerns the past 2 nights, but something in her tone now made him take her seriously. He stood up, grabbing the flashlight from the table. "Stay inside," he said, his voice calm but firm. He pulled on his jacket and opened the front door. The cold night air rushed in, making Claire shiver. Claire nodded, but the fear gnawing at her insides didn't let up. She watched from the window as Ryan stepped onto the porch, the beam of his flashlight sweeping across the clearing in front of the cabin. His movements were careful, slow, as he scanned the trees for any sign of movement. For a moment, everything seemed still. Too still. Ryan disappeared from her view as he circled around the cabin, and Claire's heart pounded in her chest. She strained to hear any sound, but the wind had picked up, rustling the branches of the trees and drowning out the quieter noises. The fire crackled behind her, but it did nothing to ease her growing sense of dread. Minutes passed, each one stretching out longer than the last. Claire's palms were sweaty, her fingers gripping the edge of the couch as she waited. She tried to reassure herself. Ryan would find nothing, just like before. It was probably an animal, maybe a deer or some other harmless creature wandering near the cabin. But deep down, she knew better. The footsteps were too precise, too human. Finally, the door creaked open, and Ryan stepped back inside, shaking his head. His expression was calm, but Claire could see the tension in his shoulders. He locked the door behind him with a quick, deliberate turn of the deadbolt. "Nothing out there," he said, walking back toward the fireplace. "I checked everywhere. You're overthinking this." But Claire wasn't convinced. Her gut told her something was wrong, terribly wrong. The sound of the footsteps, the way they seemed to get closer every night, it was all too real to dismiss. She stood up, her hands trembling slightly as she moved to check the door herself, making sure the lock was secure. Then she walked around the cabin, double-checking every window, every latch. Ryan watched her from the couch, frowning slightly. "Claire, you're stressing yourself out," he said gently. "There's nothing out there. We're in the middle of the woods. Of course, we'll hear strange noises at night. I don't think it's just animals, Ryan, Claire said, her voice tight. She reached the last window and pulled on the lock, making sure it was sealed tight. Something's watching us. Ryan sighed, running a hand through his hair. He didn't believe her, but he knew pushing back would only make her more anxious. Look, everything's locked. We're safe. No one's getting in here. Claire nodded, though her heart was still racing. She wanted to believe him, wanted to feel safe. But the feeling of being watched lingered, a constant pressure at the back of her mind. She sat down by the fire, pulling a blanket around her shoulders, trying to shake off the cold that seemed to have seeped into her bones. The night dragged on. Ryan eventually went to bed, his exhaustion from the day's hike overpowering his concerns. But Claire stayed by the fire, staring into the glowing embers as they slowly faded. Her eyes kept drifting toward the windows, her ears straining to hear any sound outside. Around midnight, the wind died down, and the cabin grew eerily quiet. Claire stood up, her body tense, as she walked to the window and peered out. The forest was dark, the trees casting long shadows across the clearing. For a moment, everything was still. Then she heard it again, the footsteps. This time, they were even closer. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She pressed her ear to the cold glass, listening. The footsteps were slow, methodical, as if someone was pacing just outside the cabin, waiting. Her skin prickled with fear, and her heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to wake Ryan, to tell him what she was hearing, but something stopped her. What if he thought she was being paranoid again? What if it really was nothing? But the sound of the footsteps continued, sending waves of dread through her. She turned away from the window, pacing the small living room, her mind racing. The cabin suddenly felt too small, too vulnerable. The walls, once comforting, now seemed thin, unable to protect them from whatever was out there. She checked the locks one last time before finally crawling into bed beside Ryan. But even as she lay there, listening to his soft, steady breathing, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The footsteps had stopped, but the fear had not. The night was silent, the kind of deep, oppressive quiet that only exists in the wilderness. Claire had finally managed to drift into a fitful sleep, her mind still buzzing with the unease that had settled into her bones over the past few days. The last thing she remembered was the flickering glow of the fire as it died down and Ryan's steady breathing beside her. But suddenly, she was wide awake. Her heart pounded in her chest, though she wasn't sure why at first. She lay there, frozen, trying to make sense of the sensation that had wrenched her out of sleep. Then, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Except this time, they weren't outside. Claire glanced at the clock, 2:13 a.m. The footsteps were heavy, slow, and deliberate. They echoed through the cabin, the wooden floorboards creaking under their weight, like someone was walking down the hall toward their bedroom. Her breath caught in her throat. Panic gripped her. These footsteps weren't muffled by the wind or distance. They were inside. She nudged Ryan, harder than before, her voice barely a whisper. "Ryan, wake up," she pleaded, her voice trembling with fear. Ryan stirred, rubbing his eyes groggily, completely unaware of the terror that had seized her. "What is it?" he mumbled, his voice heavy with sleep. "Listen," Claire whispered, her body tense, every muscle ready to flee. "Do you hear that?" Ryan paused, still half asleep, until the sound reached his ears as well. The footsteps, slow, deliberate, impossibly close. He sat up abruptly, his eyes widening as he registered the noise. It wasn't just the normal creaks of an old cabin settling. Someone was walking through the hallway. Someone who shouldn't be there. He motioned for Claire to stay quiet, his face drained of color. Grabbing the flashlight from the nightstand, Ryan silently got out of bed, the fear in his eyes matching Claire's own rising panic. His movements were slow and deliberate, as if any sudden sound might draw attention to them. The footsteps continued, closer now, each step a slow creak, like someone intentionally dragging their feet. Ryan moved toward the bedroom door, his hand trembling as he reached for the doorknob. He took a deep breath and swung the door open, the flashlight casting a narrow beam of light into the dark hallway. It was empty. The narrow hallway, with its faded wallpaper and dusty floorboards stretched out in front of him, quiet and still. Ryan shone the flashlight down the length of the corridor, scanning every corner. Nothing moved. No one was there, but the footsteps didn't stop. Claire clutched the blankets tighter around her heart racing in her chest. She strained to hear, to make sense of what was happening. The footsteps, slow, methodical, continued, moving through the hallway toward the living room. But there was no visible source, no shadow, no figure. Ryan. Claire's voice was barely a whisper now, panic rising in her throat. What's happening? Ryan stepped out into the hallway, his bare feet making no sound as he moved. He turned back to Claire, his face pale but determined. Stay here, he whispered, though she could hear the tremor in his voice. He took a few tentative steps down the hall, shining the flashlight into the darkness ahead. Every step Ryan took was matched by another creak from the floorboards, except these weren't his. The unseen footsteps continued, moving just ahead of him, almost as if someone, or something, was leading him deeper into the cabin. Claire could barely breathe, her chest tight with fear. She wanted to call out to him, to tell him to come back, but she was too afraid to make a sound. She watched as the light from Ryan's flashlight flickered through the hallway, its beam reflecting off the worn wood and casting eerie shadows. Then the footsteps stopped. For a moment, the cabin was plunged into an even deeper silence. Claire held her breath, her heart pounding in her ears. Ryan paused, standing at the threshold between the hallway and the living room, his flashlight trembling in his hand. Who's there? Ryan's voice cracked as he spoke, his words barely above a whisper. He shone the light into the living room, sweeping it across the darkened furniture, the cold fireplace, the dusty windows. There was nothing. No movement, no person. But as Claire watched from the bedroom, her pulse quickening, she noticed something Ryan hadn't. The door to the basement, hidden in the far corner of the living room, was slightly ajar. It had been locked. They hadn't even opened it since they arrived. Ryan, Claire's voice broke, her eyes locked on the basement door. She could barely get the words out. The door. Ryan's flashlight shifted toward the door, his movements slower now, more hesitant. The beam of light caught the edge of the old wooden door, swinging slightly as if recently disturbed. His breath hitched, and he took a step back, the fear in his eyes unmistakable. Without a word, Ryan walked over to the door and nudged it open with the flashlight. The heavy door creaked loudly as it swung fully open, revealing a staircase descending into pitch darkness. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence that followed was suffocating, the air thick with dread. Claire's body felt frozen, her mind racing with every terrible possibility. Then, from somewhere deep in the darkness below, came the faintest of sounds, a soft, deliberate tap, 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 as if something was slowly making its way up the stairs. Ryan's eyes widened in horror, and he stumbled back from the door, his breath quickening. The sound grew louder, more insistent, like footsteps coming closer and closer. Get back in the bedroom, Ryan said urgently, his voice shaking. Claire didn't need to be told twice. She scrambled back into the room, her hands shaking as she fumbled to lock the door behind her. She could hear Ryan moving quickly, slamming the basement door shut and locking it. But the tapping continued, now right on the other side. The unseen visitor was no longer outside. It was inside the cabin with them. Ryan had spent the better part of the early morning searching every corner of the cabin, flashlight in hand, his nerves raw and frayed from the sleepless night. Claire sat on the couch, bundled in a blanket, watching him anxiously as he moved from room to room. Every inch of the cabin had been inspected. There was no one there. No stranger lurking in the shadows. No sign of an intruder. Yet, the footsteps, as real as the floor beneath them, had stopped as abruptly as they had begun, leaving behind only a chilling silence. The rest of the night was a blur of tension and fear. They huddled together in the living room, trying to stay calm. Ryan had stoked the fire, but even the warmth from the flames couldn't shake the cold that seemed to settle into their bones. They spoke little, afraid that if they let their voices rise too much, the footsteps might start again. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and they drifted into a light, restless sleep, haunted by the thought that something, someone was still watching them. By morning, the terror from the night before felt distant, but not forgotten. The uneasy quiet that hung in the air only deepened their resolve to leave. "We can't stay here another night," Claire had said, her voice firm. Ryan agreed, and without much discussion, they packed their bags and prepared to leave. As they hurried to the car, the sun had barely risen, casting long shadows over the forest, the early morning mist clinging to the trees. Ryan threw the bags into the trunk and slid into the driver's seat, his fingers tight on the keys. Claire sat beside him, her eyes glued to the trees, still half expecting to see someone or something emerge from the woods. Ryan turned the key in the ignition. Nothing. He frowned, trying again. The engine sputtered but refused to start. He tried once more, his frustration mounting. The car was completely dead. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, popping the hood to check the battery. Everything seemed fine. The connections were solid, the battery fully charged. There was no reason for the car not to start, yet it remained as silent as the cabin had been the night before. Ryan slammed the hood shut, his frustration giving way to a growing sense of dread. "I'll call a tow truck," he said, pulling his phone from his pocket. But when he looked at the screen, his heart sank. "No signal," he muttered, showing Claire his phone. Claire rubbed her temples in disbelief. "Of course," she sighed. "Why would anything work out here?" They were stranded, at least for another night. With no other options, they made their way back inside the cabin. Ryan tried to remain calm, but Claire could see the tension in his face. The thought of spending another night in the cabin, after everything that had happened, made her stomach churn with dread. She wanted to scream, to demand they hike out and leave on foot, but deep down, she knew it wasn't safe to venture through the forest without a plan. The day passed slowly. Ryan tried to keep busy, fiddling with the car again and making a few attempts to contact someone with the cabin's landline, though the static-filled phone didn't seem to work any better than their cell service. By evening, with the sun sinking below the horizon, they found themselves back in front of the fire, a deck of cards between them, trying to distract themselves with a game of poker. But the weight of the previous nights hung over them, and every creak of the cabin's old beams sent a jolt through Claire's chest. As they sat in silence, the firelight casting flickering shadows across the room, a new sound broke through the quiet. The soft, unmistakable creak of a door opening. Claire and Ryan froze, their eyes locked on each other. "Did you hear that?" Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. Ryan didn't answer immediately. His jaw was tight, his eyes scanning the room, but he nodded. He heard it too. The sound hadn't come from the front door or any of the windows. It was inside. They both stood slowly, the hairs on the back of Claire's neck standing on end. The air felt heavier now, thick with the kind of tension that precedes a storm. The creak came again, louder this time, the sound of rusted hinges groaning under the weight of a door that hadn't been opened in years. Together, they moved toward the hallway, their steps slow and deliberate. Every instinct in Claire's body screamed for her to stop, to turn back, but she couldn't. She had to know. They followed the sound down the hallway and stopped in front of an old, weathered door. It was slightly ajar, hanging on its hinges like it hadn't been touched in years. But Claire knew they hadn't seen this door before. She was sure of it. The last time they'd walked through this hallway, there had been nothing, just walls. Now, there was a door leading somewhere they hadn't noticed. It was wide open. Ryan stared at it for a moment, his hand tightening around the flashlight he hadn't let go of since the previous night. "We didn't open that," he said quietly, his voice low, as though speaking any louder would somehow make things worse. Claire shook her head, her stomach twisting with fear. "No, we didn't." Ryan hesitated for a moment, then moved forward, pushing the door open wider with a creak. The heavy scent of damp earth and mildew filled the air, and a set of old, worn stairs descended into the basement. The sight of it sent a wave of cold terror through Claire. "The basement. Do you remember seeing this door before?" Ryan asked, his voice tight with unease. "No, Claire whispered. It wasn't here." Ryan took a deep breath, shining the flashlight down the stairs. The narrow beam illuminated stone walls lined with dust and cobwebs. The stairs led down into darkness, the basement far deeper than Claire had imagined. "Stay up here," Ryan said, his voice barely steady. "I'll check it out." "Ryan, no." Claire started, her fear spiking, but he gave her a firm look. "We need to know what's down there." He disappeared into the stairwell, the beam of his flashlight bouncing as he carefully made his way down. Claire stood at the top of the stairs, her heart racing, listening intently. Every creak of the old wood, every distant shuffle, made her stomach churn. Seconds turned into minutes. The silence below was unbearable. Then she heard it, a soft tap, 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 faint but unmistakable, as if something or someone was moving down there. "Ryan," she called, her voice trembling. For a moment, there was no response. Then, from the depths of the basement, Ryan's voice called back, his tone strained with disbelief. "Claire, you need to come down here. You're not going to believe this." Ryan hesitated at the top of the stairs, his grip tightening around the flashlight. His heart pounded as he stared down into the dark basement, where the stale air felt thick with a presence neither of them could explain. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "We didn't open that," Claire whispered from behind him, her voice shaking with fear. Ryan nodded, though his own face had gone pale. "Stay here," he said softly, though even he wasn't sure how safe staying anywhere in this cabin really was. He gave her one last look before he descended the stairs, each step creaking loudly beneath him, as if the old wood was protesting his weight. The cold air below was almost unbearable, and it smelled of mildew and damp earth. The beam from his flashlight was weak, barely cutting through the oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow everything around him. Shadows danced on the stone walls, creating eerie shapes that made his stomach twist with unease. Claire watched him disappear into the darkness, her breath shallow. She stood frozen at the top of the stairs, straining to hear anything beyond the creaking wood and her own rapid heartbeat. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. She couldn't hear anything but the soft shuffle of Ryan's footsteps below. Then, suddenly, there was a thud. Claire's heart stopped. "Ryan," she called, her voice trembling. There was no response. Another thud, louder this time, echoing up the stairwell. Panic surged through her. She grabbed the second flashlight from the table, her hands shaking as she clicked it on. The beam flickered before settling into a steady glow, casting long, eerie shadows on the stairwell walls. "Ryan," she called again, but the basement swallowed her voice. Without thinking, Claire rushed down the stairs, the flashlight bouncing in her hand. The cold air grew more oppressive with each step, and the sound of her shoes echoed in the damp space. The basement was larger than she had expected, the ceiling low and the walls lined with old tools, dusty shelves, and boxes long forgotten. Her flashlight swept across the room, illuminating cobwebs and rusted metal. The basement looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, but as she scanned the floor, something caught her eye. Asterisk footprints, asterisk in the thick layer of dust. Fresh footprints. Claire crouched down, her breath catching in her throat. The footprints were larger than Ryan's, deeper, like someone much heavier had walked through the room recently. She followed the trail with the beam of her flashlight, her pulse quickening. The prints led across the room and stopped in the far corner, where the shadows seemed to thicken. She stood slowly, her legs trembling, and followed the trail. As she neared the corner, her flashlight landed on a figure. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He was standing there, motionless, his back turned to her. The beam of her flashlight caught the pale, rigid outline of his body. Something was wrong. Claire's breath hitched, and she stepped closer, her eyes locked on him. His posture was tense, his hands hanging limply by his sides, but it was his silence that terrified her. "Ryan," she said again, this time louder, her voice shaking. He didn't move. Her flashlight flickered in her hand as she stepped closer, the sound of her own breathing loud in the stillness of the basement. Then she saw it. Standing in the corner, partially hidden by the darkness, was a figure, tall and shadowy. It loomed over Ryan, its face obscured by the thick shadows that clung to the walls. Claire's heart raced. and a wave of cold fear washed over her, freezing her in place. Ryan's eyes were wide, his face drained of all color. He turned his head just slightly, enough for Claire to see the sheer terror in his expression. His lips moved, barely forming the words. "Claire, run!" The figure shifted, stepping forward, and as the faint light from her flashlight finally caught its features, Claire's stomach twisted in horror. The figure was human, or at least it had been once. Its face was gaunt, skin stretched thin over its skull, with eyes sunken deep into dark hollows. Its clothes were tattered and stained, hanging loosely from its skeletal frame, and its hands, long, bony fingers, reached toward Ryan. The basement felt like it was closing in, the air thick and stifling. Claire's legs felt heavy, her muscles locked in place as the figure's hollow gaze turned toward her. The darkness around it seemed to pulse, as if the very shadows were alive, shifting with the creature's movement. Ryan's voice cracked, desperate. "Go! Now!" Claire's body snapped into action. She turned and bolted up the stairs, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The flashlight swung wildly in her hand as she stumbled, barely catching herself on the rail as she reached the top. The sound of footsteps, heavy dragging, echoed behind her, but she didn't look back. Bursting into the living room, Claire slammed the basement door shut and twisted the lock, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She backed away, her eyes fixed on the door, waiting for it to burst open. For a moment, the only sound was her own breathing, ragged and desperate. Then, the silence that followed was worse than the noise. She stood there, her back pressed against the wall, her mind racing. Ryan was still down there, and so was it. She couldn't leave him. She couldn't just run. But what she had seen, what she felt in that basement, was something beyond her understanding. The sense of dread had settled deep into her bones, and the weight of it was suffocating. Suddenly, from behind the basement door, came a soft, rhythmic tapping. Claire stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat, the dim beam of her flashlight flickering weakly in her trembling hand. The figure behind Ryan was tall, impossibly tall, its form cloaked in a thick shadow that seemed to ripple in the faint light. Its features were hidden, obscured by the darkness, but she could feel its presence. Asterisk, cold asterisk, unnatural and suffocating. "Claire," Ryan whispered, his voice barely a breath. "Get out of here, now!" His voice was weak, strained as if every word pained him. Claire's heart hammered in her chest, her body screaming at her to move, but she was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. She watched in horror as the figure slowly turned its head toward her, its eyes catching the dim light of her flashlight. They were cold and empty, two hollow voids that pierced through her, draining every ounce of warmth from the room. The figure was no longer just a shadow. It was something much worse. It shifted closer to Ryan, its movements slow and deliberate. One of its hands reached out toward him, long, bony fingers stretching impossibly far, their edges sharp and unnatural. As the figure's hand closed around Ryan's shoulder, he winced in pain, his face contorting as if something inside him was being drained. "Run," Ryan gasped, barely able to get the words out. His body seemed to sag under the weight of the figure's touch, his strength fading with every second. Claire's mind screamed at her to move, but her body felt like lead, paralyzed by the sheer terror of what was happening. She watched helplessly as the figure's grip tightened on Ryan, his body trembling as though some unseen force was consuming him. The flashlight slipped from her hand, clattering to the ground with a hollow sound that seemed to echo endlessly in the basement. The noise jolted her back to reality. Without thinking, Claire stumbled backward, her legs weak and unsteady. She turned, her heart pounding in her ears, and bolted up the stairs, the sound of her own panicked footsteps drowning out everything else. Behind her, she could hear the figure's footsteps following, heavy, deliberate, each step echoing through the narrow stairwell. The floorboards creaked under the weight of something far larger than it should have been, the sound growing louder and closer with every second. Claire's breath came in ragged gasps as she reached the top of the stairs, her vision blurred with fear. She could feel the presence behind her, the cold air pressing in on her like a weight she couldn't shake. The cabin felt impossibly small now, the walls closing in, the shadows longer and darker than they had ever been. She didn't stop to close the basement door. She didn't stop for anything. Bursting through the front door, Claire was hit by a blast of cold, rain-soaked air. The storm that had been brewing for hours had finally unleashed itself, rain pouring down in thick sheets, the wind howling through the trees like a living thing. The sky was dark, clouds swirling overhead in a chaotic mess, but it felt like a reprieve from the oppressive darkness inside the cabin. She didn't stop running. The rain soaked through her clothes, chilling her to the bone, but she barely noticed. Her legs moved on instinct, her mind still reeling from what she had seen. She ran down the narrow dirt path that led from the cabin to the road, her feet slipping in the mud, her breath coming in shallow, desperate gasps. It wasn't until she reached the edge of the road, a winding, desolate stretch that cut through the forest, that she collapsed, her knees giving out beneath her. She fell to the ground, gasping for air, her chest heaving as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The storm raged on around her, the wind whipping through the trees, the rain pelting her face, but all Claire could think about was Ryan. He was still in there, trapped. With it, for a moment, she considered going back. She couldn't leave him. She couldn't just run. But the memory of the figure, its cold, empty eyes, its hand on Ryan's shoulder, was too much. She couldn't move. She couldn't face it again. When Claire finally gathered the courage to look back toward the cabin, it was still, silent. The only movement came from the swaying trees and the rain falling steadily from the sky. The windows were dark, the door slightly ajar, as if nothing had happened at all. But she knew better. She could still feel its presence, lurking in the darkness, watching her. The next morning, when the authorities arrived, the cabin was eerily quiet. Claire had managed to flag down a passing car, her story barely coherent as she tried to explain what had happened. The police were skeptical, of course, chalking her fear up to exhaustion, maybe some sort of breakdown. But when they stepped inside the cabin, they found it exactly as she had described, silent, untouched. Ryan was gone. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication of where he might have gone. His belongings were still there, his phone sitting on the kitchen table. The only thing out of place was the basement door, which stood wide open, the darkness below thick and impenetrable. The dust on the floor revealed a single set of footprints, much larger than Ryan's, leading from the basement and out into the woods behind the cabin. They searched for days, combing the woods for any sign of Ryan. But there was nothing. No trail, no clues, no explanation. Ryan had vanished, as if swallowed by the darkness itself. And Claire knew, deep down, that whatever had taken him wasn't human. The figure, the cold emptiness in its eyes, the way it seemed to drain the very life from Ryan, it was something far worse. She never returned to the cabin. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the darkness presses in, she swears she can still hear those footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing through the empty halls of her mind.